Good evening. As always, I hope you and your families are well. Tonight, we're going to be continuing in our study through the book of Habakkuk. And this will be part 6 of our series. So if by chance this is your first time joining us, I would highly recommend you go back and check out the previous episodes. But last week, we spent a good bit of time focusing on one very important verse. And if you were with us, you'll know we zeroed in on Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. And I hope you were able to see through that conversation how important that verse is to the entire book of Habakkuk. But just in case you missed it, or if you zoned out when we were talking about Greek and Hebrew words, I'm going to try really quickly to just give us like a 30,000 foot overview of what we have seen so far. And again, when we read the book of Habakkuk, when we're reading the book of Habakkuk, what we are seeing is that we are listening in on a conversation between Habakkuk, who is a prophet among the people of Judah, and Yahweh, his God. So that's what the book of Habakkuk is. It's a conversation between Habakkuk and God. And the gist of the conversation is that Habakkuk is confused and he's upset. At first, he's upset because he's seen terrible wickedness among his own people, and he wants to know how long God is just going to kind of sit by and do nothing about it. But then we saw that God answered him, and God says to Habakkuk, he says he is doing something about it. But he says what he's going to do is so shocking that the people wouldn't believe it even if they were told. And he tells them what he's doing. He says, he's raising up the Chaldeans. And remember, from several weeks back, we looked at the Chaldeans in detail. And we saw that they were a fierce and wicked people. They went across the land conquering and enslaving different people groups. And they would eventually become the Babylonian Empire. And Habakkuk is utterly shocked that God has revealed that he is the one who has raised them up. Habakkuk is utterly shocked that they are to be God's instrument of judgment on his own people. And I think there are two reasons, again, that this is such a shock for Habakkuk. First, Habakkuk doesn't understand how God could send the Chaldeans to wipe out his own people when he had already, way back in Genesis, made an everlasting covenant with Abraham to bless his descendants and to bless the world through those descendants. So for Habakkuk, if the Chaldeans destroy God's people, then God's promise to Abraham would fail. But also Habakkuk is shocked because he wants to know, how is this just? Is justice truly done if the people who are being sent to judge Israel, God's people, are more wicked than Israel herself? And if you'll remember at the end of chapter 1, Habakkuk wants to know if the Chaldeans will just continue in their wicked way forever, right? They conquer people, they slay nations, they drag them away like fish caught in a net, if you'll remember the poetic imagery from chapter 1. And Habakkuk asks God, will it always be this way? Will it always be this way? And then God responds. And if you remember in chapter 2, the beginning of it, God tells Habakkuk that he is going to give him a vision. And he told Habakkuk to write the vision on tablets. And this vision will be for the future. And many generations will continue to proclaim the truth of this vision until it fully arrives. And we saw that the content of this vision was revealed to us in verse 4 of chapter 2, which says, "Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith." Now, last week, we looked at this verse in detail, but the basic thing to remember is this. God is telling Habakkuk essentially two things. First, the proud, the arrogant, those who rely on their own abilities and trust in themselves, they are not right or not righteous before God, and their end is certain destruction. And secondly, the righteous, the ones who are declared to be among God's people. These are those who have faith. This is how Abraham was justified before God way back then, and it is how all men must be justified before God. Which means for Habakkuk, that even in the midst of all this chaos with the Chaldeans coming, God is preserving a faithful remnant for himself. And we see God do this throughout the Bible. I think of one very famous story with Elijah and the prophets of Baal. If you remember, Elijah thinks that he is the only faithful Israelite left. He thinks he's the last one. But God tells him, no, that's not true. Even now, there are 7,000 who haven't bent the knee and worshiped Baal. So for Habakkuk, he begins to realize that God may be bringing judgment on the house of Judah, absolutely. But even still, he would preserve a remnant through which the promises to Abraham would continue. But tonight, what we are going to do is continue reading in chapter 2. And really what we are going to see is God answering Habakkuk's complaint in detail. Again, remember, Habakkuk wants to know, will the wicked get off the hook? Like, will justice be served? And specifically, will the Chaldeans continue forever unpunished? Well, tonight we are going to see exactly what God thinks about that. So if you have your Bible, I would invite you to open with me to Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 5. But again, the thing before we jump into verse 5 here, remember verse 4. God has told Habakkuk the summary content of the vision in verse 4. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. And now what he's going to do is he's going to expand on that starting in verse 5 and all the way through the rest of the chapter. So we're going to pick up in verse 5, and it's God expanding on the vision, the content really, which is a summary statement given in verse 4. So verse 5 says this, furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all peoples. Okay, at first reading, this may seem kind of confusing, right? I mean, I can see that. Why does God all of a sudden seem to switch gears? He's talking about the proud one being unrighteous, and all of a sudden it seems as if he goes down a rabbit trail talking about like alcohol or something. Couple of interesting things to point out. First, the word wine, which is what probably most of your translations say. There's been a debate about this word and what it actually means. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the 1940s, they were buried in caves in Qumran, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, they say here, wealth betrays the haughty man. So I think it's safe to say that God's probably not singling out the sin of drunkenness here. Certainly a sin, but I don't know if he's singling that sin out. I think the point of the verse is showing perhaps the relationship between the prideful and what we could label maybe their excesses, right? So if the excess in mind is strong drink, for example, I want you to think about that. What does that do, right? Well, let's think. Drinking to a point of drunkenness doesn't make a person prideful or arrogant. But often, when someone is drunk, it exposes what is already there. It pulls the veil back, if you will. I think that's why this verse says, wine betrays the haughty. It betrays the haughty. Now, what's interesting about this is there's a story in the book of Daniel that brilliantly displays this. In fact, the story is dealing with the same culprit Habakkuk is concerned about, the prideful Babylonians, right? That's who Habakkuk's worried about, the Chaldeans who remember become the Babylonians. In Daniel 5, which is after Habakkuk, there is a story about King Belshazzar of Babylon. And in that story, this king, in his arrogance, he throws a party. And what he does is he brings in all of the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem that the Babylonians had pillaged a few decades earlier. And he pours wine into them, and he and his nobles begin to drink until they're drunk, and they worship gods of wood and stone and all sorts of other things. And then in the midst of this, a mysterious hand appears and writes words on a wall. And it causes him to tremble in fear. And in the story, Daniel comes in, he's called in, and he reveals the meaning to the king. And he talks about how his predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, had been an arrogant man, but at a point in his life had eventually become humble. But the same isn't true for King Belshazzar. And Daniel's words echo what we read here in Habakkuk. And this is what he says. So I want to read this to you. This is in Daniel chapter 5, starting in verse 22. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this, talking about what Nebuchadnezzar what happened to him. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways you have not glorified. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. So now Daniel's going to tell us what the inscription says. Now, this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Sorry, tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Okay, think justice, okay? Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. And then if we jump down just a few verses later, we find that King Belshazzar was slain that very night. So what we see in this story from Daniel is that we see God's proverb in Habakkuk actually playing out. Wine has betrayed the arrogant man, King Belshazzar of Babylon. He drank from sacred vessels, and in his drunken state, he is glorifying false gods. And then that very night, he was told that his kingdom would be overthrown and his own life was taken from him. So back to Habakkuk now. If we look back in Habakkuk, we can see how these words from God are a promise. The wicked will run to their own ruin. This is true for individuals, and it is true for nations and empires. And that's one of the things that I want you to keep in mind as we continue kind of marching through Habakkuk. These words from God aren't specifically for just one individual or even one people. Yes, in the context of this book, you can clearly see that Habakkuk has the Chaldeans in his mind. But remember, this is a vision not just for Habakkuk's day, but also for future generations. It's a vision that will continue to stand until God brings about the close of history. So these truths that we're going to read aren't just located in the past or at one particular point in time. What we are seeing, and what we will see more of very soon, is that God is talking about the rise and the fall of wicked empires and people and nations and kingdoms throughout history. So what we read here can be true of multiple people and nations at one time. We're going to talk more about that as we keep going. So jumping back into Habakkuk, we're back in chapter 2, and we're going to pick back up in verse 5. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all peoples. Okay, so here again, we see that the prideful, the unrighteous, they are said to have appetites like Sheol. Now, if you happen to have watched our series on Jonah, the previous series we did, we talked about Sheol in that series. And again, in the ancient Jewish understanding, especially in the Old Testament here, Sheol was the place where all the dead went. It was very similar to the Greek idea of Hades. When you died, you went to Sheol. So that's why Sheol is being used here as a poetic device. Sheol has a wide mouth, so to speak. It swallows up everything. So the proud, their appetites are compared to Sheol. They're like Sheol. They are never satisfied. And then we are told that they gather all nations and all peoples to themselves. So here we can clearly see that God has in mind empires, specifically Babylon, right? But this verse has a wider application. It is true of all empires that are built on warfare and violence and wicked practices and conquering other people. I want you to look at what God says in the next verse, in verse 6. This is what he says. Will not all of these, all of who? All of these people that these wicked empires have gathered to themselves, will not all of these take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him? Okay, so God is telling Habakkuk, all of these nations that these wicked empires conquer, they are going to take up a taunt song against them. They are going to mock them. In other words, what God is telling Habakkuk is a direct answer to his question at the end of chapter 1. Remember, will the Chaldeans go on forever slaying nations, O God? How is that just? And God says, no, they will not. Babylon will fall. The victim will be vindicated and get the final word. All the wrongs will be eventually made right. Now, what happens next is interesting. What happens next in the text here? From the second half of verse 6, actually all the way through the end of chapter 2, God is going to elaborate on what this taunt song will be that the victims will sing over the wicked. And this is given in the format of 5 woes. So over the remainder of the chapter, we are going to kind of unpack these 5 woes that are pronounced on the wicked. So let's jump back in and see what these woes look like, starting in the back half of verse 6. And say, woe to him who increases what is not his, for how long? And make himself rich with loans. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them, because you have looted many nations. All the remainder of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all its inhabitants. So there are several things going on here, but let's kind of start by noting the first woe is targeting specifically those nations or empires or people, whoever you want to see as the target, but it's specifically talking about those that increase their own share through what we could call maybe corrupt economic practices. And one theme, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, one theme that's clear throughout the Bible is that God does not condone the practice of charging excessive interest on loans. There's debate on whether or not God allowed any interest at all, but no one debates that God spoke against excessive interest. No one will debate that. So for the nations and the empires that use economic leverage to increase their own share while holding down others, God has something to say to them. And what this verse is saying is that for those who do this, the same is going to happen to you. In a moment, he says, those from which you have borrowed and suddenly demand repayment, they're going to rise up and they are going to loot you. They will plunder you, just like you have plundered others. This woe is in fact very similar to the parable that Jesus speaks in the New Testament about the unforgiving servant. Remember in that parable, there's a debtor who is forgiven what he owes by his master. And if you remember, he owed like an enormous amount of money. Yet this very same person then refuses to forgive someone who owes him pennies, basically. And Jesus practically says, because of his unwillingness to forgive when he was forgiven, this man will be thrown into hell until he has paid back every last penny of his debt. So I see this first woe kind of in similar light to that parable. Each nation will receive the same treatment with which they have treated others. Now let's look at the second woe. Starting in verse 9, God says this: "Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples, so you are sinning against yourself." That's interesting. "Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework." Now again, this woe is targeting unjust economic practices, but it's slightly more nuanced than the first one. This woe is talking about those empires that seek evil gain, but with the specific aim of their own security. Okay, notice the text says, "Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high." Okay, this is the idea of a bird or something putting a nest in a secure place up high so nothing could challenge it or get to it. And then he says, "to be delivered from the hand of calamity." Okay, so here what we are talking about is those nations that will do whatever is necessary to protect their own interest or their own national security, so to speak. Kingdoms that will do whatever is necessary to ensure that their kingdom will remain. And basically, people that do this and kingdoms and empires that do this, they trust that somehow the wealth or the technology that they have accumulated will make them unassailable. But the irony of this is that whoever takes this road leads to their own self-destruction. Notice what the text says. They're sinning against themselves. That's interesting because it says a house is being used in this passage as a metaphor. A house is being used as a metaphor for a civilization, a kingdom, or an empire, and the house is concerned with its own self-preservation. So we're talking about a house, but it represents a civilization or a kingdom. And the house is employing whatever means necessary to make sure that it continues to exist. Yet because the house has done this, look at verse 11, the stones, the walls, the rafters, the framework, these things will cry out against it. In other words, this road leads to self-destruction. And I think history is actually ripe with examples of this coming to pass, right? Babylon the Great, it would fall as quickly as it had ascended. The Greek Empire that Alexander forged, and it spanned all the way to India. At his death, it would split into 4 empires who would compete. Later after that, Rome, an empire unlike the world had ever seen, would fracture and fall from within. So God here is painting a picture. The rise and fall of wicked nations. It's cyclical. And this cycle of wickedness will continue on its self-destructive course until a certain point. We'll get there. Now, what about the third woe? Let's start looking in verse 12 and see what we can say about that. "Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence.
Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that people toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Very famous verse there. But this woe here is perhaps my favorite of all five, because God is drawing on some very important themes in the biblical story. And let's unpack those for a minute. The woe specifically is targeting those who build cities or towns, and we can extrapolate from that nations from wicked means, but particularly violence. Violence is what is singled out here. And this idea of building a city, it actually goes all the way back to the beginning of Genesis, in fact. Many theologians have noticed something very striking. The biblical story begins in Genesis in a garden. But if we jump to the other end of the story, all the way to Revelation 21 and 22, where does it end? It ends in a city. So theologians have realized that humans were tasked with moving God's creation project forward. We were tasked from Genesis 1 and 2 with wisely ruling and subduing. And the proper end of that task will involve a city. So the idea of city building, if you will, it's a very biblical thing to do if it's done in the way God intended. But clearly, in this third woe here, there is a way to build a city that God frowns upon. God frowns upon those who build cities using violence and bloodshed. And he says all of their toil, all of their work, it's for nothing. It's worthless. It only brings fire, actually. In other words, they're inviting judgment, and their efforts, it's all vanity. It's for naught. No matter how impressive it may appear, no matter how glorious the city might look in the moment, it will be reduced to rubble. Now, what's even more interesting, I think, about this woe here is that in Genesis, there are two specific men who are mentioned to be city builders, if you will. The first is Cain. You remember Cain and Abel. Cain is said to have built a city after he was banished, and we know also that Cain is the first person in history who acted in violence to murder someone. Now, that's interesting in and of itself, but the other person in Genesis who is said to be a city builder is a guy by the name of Nimrod. Now, what's really interesting about Nimrod is that he was said to be a mighty hunter, which may mean that he was good at killing animals. It may also mean he was good at hunting and carrying out violence on people. But either way, what's certain about Nimrod is that Genesis tells us he was the founder of a specific city. And can you guess, by chance, what city Nimrod founded? It was Babylon. So what we see here in this third woe is that any city founded and built on violence is destined for ruin. Babylon, the great, this city was founded on violence, right? The violence of Nimrod. It's destined for ruin. It literally toils for nothing but fire, the text says. This is not the way God intended humans to carry out the vocation that he gave them in Genesis 1 and 2. Yes, they were to build cities, and we see that our final destination in the Bible is a city, the New Jerusalem. But they were to build cities in a way that honored God and pointed to him. And I think this is why God says in verse 14, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." This verse, I think, has to be one of the most hopeful verses in the book, maybe even in the entire Bible. it's a promise to Habakkuk and to us that regardless of what the present circumstances look like, regardless of the fact that wicked nations continue in their wicked ways, even though they appear to prosper now, their end is certain, and the entire earth will be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. All right, so let's keep going. Let's look at the fourth woe. This woe starts in verse 15. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beast by which you terrified them because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all of its inhabitants. All right. So I think what we need to see here, there's actually a couple things that I want to point out, but this woe is interesting because it talks about the leaders of the wicked empires who are reveling in debauchery, if you will. But what specifically is said is that they force their own perversions, their own wicked ways on others. They influence their neighbors to join them on their own road to destruction. And God says, woe to them. They are depraved. They worship all forms of sensuality rather than giving glory to God. And because they have forced others to join them in their debauchery, because they have forced others to drink the cup they have offered, the Lord will force them to drink the cup that He offers. And by the way, this is none other than what theologians have recognized as the cup of His wrath. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, is what the text says. His right hand clearly symbolizes His power and His might, and the cup symbolizes His wrath. So what's interesting, though, I think, is that, remember, Babylon is God's instrument of wrath on Israel, right? We're told that. God says He's raising them up to be judgment on Israel for their own wickedness. So in a sense, the cup which Babylon brings to their neighbors, it is God's wrath. But the point here is God is answering Habakkuk. The point is this: Babylon too will be forced to drink from this cup. So the verse here, I can't help but every time I read this, think about a specific song. Maybe some of you have thought about it, I don't know. But it's a Johnny Cash song, and it's When the Man Comes Around. If you haven't ever heard it, go listen to it. It's a good song. But the point is simply this: God is going to bring about a reckoning for all people. But for those people and those nations that entice and force others to join them on their wicked path, a reckoning is coming. Let's keep going. Finally, the fifth woe, it's the final one, starts in verse 18, and it'll take us all the way to the end of the chapter. What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image, a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise, and that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside it. But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before Him. So finally, we arrive at the last words that God speaks in the book. This is the last thing God says to Habakkuk. And this fifth woe is especially significant because it dives straight to the heart of the problem. See, all the other woes are kind of symptoms, if you will, of this one. Because the issue at play, the root issue that goes all the way back to Genesis 3 is idolatry. When humans worship something other than God, everything falls apart. So we see here that the engine, if you will, that leads all of these wicked nations to ruin is idolatry. They worship a piece of wood or a stone or a figurine that's overlaid with gold and silver. And the Lord says, you fools, these things are powerless. Will they awake if you say wake? Can they hear you? No, they cannot speak. They are nothing. Now, I know that there is a temptation among us, civilized folk, if you will, who live in the 21st century. We look at this and we think, yeah, those people were just dumb. They were barbaric and they had no idea how the world really works. Well, first of all, let me just say, I think the year 2020 has shown us that the world is a lot stranger than we may have thought. But regardless, these people weren't stupid, okay? Yes, they were foolish, but trust me, so are we many times. But these people knew good and well that the idols that they carved were representative of different gods and goddesses that they believed to be active in the world. But the New Testament is clear. It's clear. When someone covets, that's idolatry. When someone lusts, that's idolatry. Right? Even if they don't have a statue to Aphrodite in their home, they are worshiping the goddess of sex. They are engaging in the same foolishness that these people were engaging in. And you would truly have to be a fool to believe that we don't worship sex and greed in America today. See, when we do this, as Paul says in Romans, we exchange the glory of God for a lie. We worship a part of the creation rather than the Creator Himself. And when we do that, we literally dehumanize ourselves. We become beast. We run headlong into depravity. We self-destruct, and our end will be certain ruin. So God here is telling Habakkuk, through all of these woes, the wicked nations, the wicked individual, they will not persist. Regardless of what it looks like in the present, Habakkuk, regardless of what it seems like in the moment in which you are looking around you, these people, these nations, they won't persist. They're cursed. Their ruin is certain. And God ends his vision to Habakkuk by showing him a picture. All the earth will hush before him. There's coming a day when the only action the wicked can take is to shut up and be silent before the Lord. All their boast, all their haughty words, they will be silent before their Creator. As Paul says in Philippians, there is coming a day, and may it come soon, when every knee, not just a few, but every knee, men, women, old and young, the knees of the homeless and the knees of the president, every single knee will bow before King Jesus. And tonight, as we close, I hope that these 5 woes have kind of gotten your attention, maybe. That's kind of what I think they're there for. Because even though the context here is dealing with nations, and perhaps a specific nation of Babylon or the Chaldeans, do not for one second think that these verses don't have something to say to individuals like you and me. If we live like the wicked, then a day is coming for us when our knees will fall before Jesus in despair and horror. It's certain. But if by faith we live as righteous men and women before God, as this text says in Habakkuk, a day is coming that we will fall before King Jesus and exuberant joy and awe. So I pray that you will examine your own life in light of these 5 woes. And I pray that if there are areas in your life that don't align with righteousness, I pray that God will open your eyes to those areas and that you will repent and surrender those to Him. But for those of you who, like Habakkuk maybe, are suffering under the hand of wicked people and wicked systems perpetuated by wicked leaders, I pray that you will take heart. No matter what the circumstances look like, the tables will be turned. Right? The villain does not get away in the end. Justice will be served. God will make all wrongs right. So I pray that you will rest in that and take heart. But until next time, stay safe. God bless.